Every single day, you make thousands of choices. You decide what to focus on, what to believe, and how to react when things get tough. But if you feel stuck, overwhelmed, or unsure of your next move, the problem might not be your effort. It might be the way you process your thoughts. When your mind is cluttered with doubt and second-guessing, your energy drains quickly. You can feel the tension in your shoulders and that knot of frustration in your stomach. This audiobook is your practical blueprint to change that. Critical thinking is not a dry academic skill. It is a daily practice that clears away the mental noise so you can make confident decisions without looking back. Over the course of this audio experience, you will discover simple, real-world tools to sharpen your focus, break bad mental habits, and build strong daily discipline. Stay with me until the very end, because we are going to unpack one surprising mental mistake that quietly ruins most people's progress, and the exact steps you can take today to fix it. Take a deep breath, grab your notebook, and let's start building the mindset you need for lasting growth and success. Chapter 1. Recognize the hidden beliefs that silently control your choices. You walk through your days making choices that feel like your own. You pick a job, you choose a relationship, you decide whether to speak up in a meeting or stay quiet. You choose to save money or spend it. You choose to try something new or stick with what you know. Every one of these choices feels like it comes from you, from your own free will, from your own careful thinking. But here is a truth that most people never stop to examine. A huge percentage of your choices are not really choices at all. They are reactions. They are patterns. They are the output of beliefs that were planted in your mind years ago, often before you were even old enough to question them. And those beliefs have been running quietly in the background ever since, shaping what you think is possible for you and what you think is not. This is the first and most important skill of critical thinking. Before you can think clearly about the world, you have to think clearly about yourself. You have to learn to spot the invisible rules that you have been living by without ever choosing them on purpose. These rules hide inside ordinary thoughts. They sound like simple facts. They sound like common sense. But they are not facts. They are beliefs. And beliefs can be wrong, and beliefs can be changed. Think about where your beliefs actually came from. When you were a small child, you did not have the tools to evaluate whether something was true or false. You simply absorbed what you were told and what you observed. If a parent said, "Money is hard to come by," you absorbed that as truth. If a teacher said, "You were not good at math," you absorbed that as truth. If you watched the adults around you avoid conflict, apologize for taking up space, or settle for less than they deserved, you absorbed those patterns as the normal way to live. None of this happened through careful reasoning. It happened through repetition and emotion, which are the two most powerful forces for building belief in a young mind. And once a belief is built early enough and reinforced often enough, it stops feeling like a belief. It starts feeling like the truth about how the world works. This is exactly why so many capable, intelligent people stay stuck. It is not because they lack ability, it is not because they lack opportunity. It is because somewhere inside them sits an old belief that quietly overrides every rational decision they try to make. A person might read every book on entrepreneurship, attend every seminar, and still never start the business, because a belief formed decades ago whispers that people like them do not succeed at that kind of thing. A person might want deep, honest connection in their relationships, yet keep everyone at a safe distance, because somewhere along the way they learned that closeness leads to pain. These beliefs do not announce themselves. They do not walk up to you and say, "Here I am controlling your life." They hide inside your instincts. They disguise themselves as your personality. They convince you that this is simply who you are, rather than a story you were told and accepted before you had the power to question it. Recognizing these hidden beliefs requires a kind of honesty that most people avoid, because it is uncomfortable. It means looking at your own life and asking hard questions instead of accepting easy answers. It means noticing the moments when you hold back, when you shrink, when you talk yourself out of something before you even try, and instead of moving past those moments quickly, stopping to ask why. Why did I just assume that would not work? Why did I just assume they would say no? Why did I just assume I am not the kind of person who does that? These questions feel small, but they open a door into the machinery running underneath your daily life. One of the clearest signs of a hidden belief is a pattern that repeats itself across different situations and different people. If you keep ending up in relationships where you feel unseen, that is not bad luck happening 5 separate times. If you keep starting projects and abandoning them right before they could succeed, that is not a coincidence. If you keep finding reasons why this is not the right time, this is not the right opportunity, this is not the right moment, over and over across years, that pattern is trying to tell you something. It is pointing directly at a belief that is steering you away from the very things you say you want. The outer circumstances change, the people change, the timing changes, but the pattern stays the same, and that consistency is the fingerprint of a hidden belief at work. Here is something important to understand about these beliefs. They were not placed inside you to harm you. Most of them formed as a form of protection. A child who learns that speaking up leads to punishment will develop a belief that staying quiet is safer, and that belief protects them in that environment. A person who was let down by someone they trusted may develop a belief that trusting deeply leads to pain, and that belief protects them from being hurt again. These beliefs made sense once, they served a purpose once. The problem is that most people never go back to check whether the belief is still true or still needed. They carry a belief built for a version of their life that no longer exists, and they let it run the current version of their life without ever questioning its authority. A belief that once protected a frightened child can end up limiting a capable adult simply because nobody ever went back to examine it. This is where discipline becomes essential, because catching these beliefs takes real effort. Your mind does not want to question itself. It wants efficiency. It wants to run on autopilot, using the same assumptions it has always used, because examining every belief you hold would be exhausting if you tried to do it constantly. So your mind builds shortcuts, and those shortcuts become invisible over time. The work of critical thinking is choosing, on purpose, to slow down and examine the shortcuts your mind has been using without your permission. Start with a simple, practical exercise. Take a piece of paper or open a note on your phone and write down 5 areas of your life where you feel stuck or frustrated. It might be your finances, your career, your relationships, your health, your confidence in social situations. For each one, write down the belief sitting underneath the frustration. Do not write the surface complaint. Write the belief. If you feel stuck financially, the surface complaint might be, "I do not make enough money." The belief underneath might be something like, "People from where I come from do not get wealthy," or "Money changes people for the worse," or "I do not deserve to have more than I need." If you feel stuck in relationships, the surface complaint might be, "I keep meeting the wrong people." The belief underneath might be, "I am too much for people," or "If someone really knew me, they would leave." Once you have written these beliefs down, look at them honestly and ask one direct question about each. Is this actually true, or is this something I absorbed a long time ago and never questioned? You will find that most of these beliefs cannot survive honest scrutiny. They were built on a handful of painful experiences or on the words of people who were themselves limited by their own hidden beliefs, and they were never built on solid evidence. A parent who struggled with money was not delivering universal truth when they said, "Money is hard to come by." They were describing their own limited experience and calling it a law of the universe. You do not have to inherit that law. You are allowed to test it for yourself. Real-world application means taking this practice out of the notebook and into your daily behavior. Every time you catch yourself making a decision automatically, pause and ask what belief is driving this. If you are about to decline an opportunity, ask yourself if you are declining because of real, current information or because of an old belief reacting on autopilot. If you notice yourself apologizing for something that needs no apology, ask what belief is telling you that you are too much or not enough. If you notice yourself avoiding a difficult conversation, ask what belief convinced you that speaking honestly leads to disaster. This is not about judging yourself for having these beliefs. Every person on this earth carries some. This is about developing the habit of noticing them in real time, instead of letting them operate silently for another 10 years. There is a particular kind of freedom that comes from this practice, and it is hard to describe until you have felt it yourself. The moment you realize that a limitation you have carried your entire life is not a fact about who you are, but a belief you can choose to release, something shifts. You stop feeling trapped by your own mind and start feeling like you actually have a hand on the wheel. This is the real meaning of self-mastery. It is not about forcing yourself through willpower to do things you hate. It is about clearing out the false beliefs so that your natural motivation and your natural intelligence can finally operate without interference. A disciplined mind treats every strong reaction as information worth investigating, rather than a truth to simply accept. When you feel a surge of fear at the thought of trying something new, that fear is not proof that you should not try. It might simply be an old belief protecting territory it no longer needs to protect. When you feel resistance toward believing something good is possible for you, that resistance is not evidence that good things are impossible. It might be a belief formed in a much harder season of your life, one that never received the update that your life has changed since then. This work is not comfortable, and it is not meant to be. Growth of any kind requires you to sit with discomfort long enough to see clearly what is actually there, rather than turning away the moment it starts to feel uneasy. The people who transform their lives are not the ones who avoid this discomfort. They are the ones who lean into it with steady attention, examining their own minds the way a careful craftsman examines a piece of wood before deciding how to shape it. They do not flinch from what they find. They study it, they understand where it came from, and then they decide, consciously, whether to keep it or set it down. You are not required to carry every belief you were handed. You did not choose most of them in the first place. They were given to you before you had the ability to evaluate them, absorbed through repetition, emotion, and example, long before you had any real say in the matter. But you have that ability now. You have the capacity, right now, in this moment, to look honestly at the beliefs running your life and ask whether they deserve the authority you have been giving them. This single skill, the ability to see your own hidden beliefs clearly, is the foundation everything else in this book will be built on. Without it, every other tool of critical thinking will be filtered through assumptions you never examined. With it, you gain the ability to finally choose your life on purpose, instead of simply reacting to a script written for you long ago by people who were doing their best with what they knew, but who never had the final say over who you become. That final say belongs to you, starting with the willingness to see clearly and the courage to keep looking, even when what you find is uncomfortable. This is where mastery of the mind begins, and it begins the moment you stop assuming your thoughts are automatically true and start treating them as something worth examining with the same care you would give to any decision that shapes the rest of your life. Chapter 2. Question every assumption before you accept it as truth. Every single day, your mind makes thousands of judgments without asking for permission first. You see a stranger and decide within seconds whether they seem trustworthy. You hear an idea and decide within moments whether it sounds reasonable or foolish. You face a challenge and decide almost instantly whether it is something you can handle or something beyond your reach. None of these judgments come with a warning label. None of them announce themselves as guesses or estimates. They arrive dressed as certainty, as fact, as simply the way things are. This is the quiet danger of assumption, and learning to question it is one of the sharpest tools you will ever develop for seeing your life and your world with real clarity. An assumption is different from a lie. A lie knows it is false. An assumption believes it is true, and that confidence is exactly what makes it dangerous. You do not fight against your assumptions the way you fight against an obvious deception, because your mind has already filed them under settled truth. It has stopped questioning them the same way you stop questioning whether the sun will rise tomorrow. The trouble is that most assumptions are not laws of nature. They are conclusions your mind reached quickly, using limited information, often under emotional pressure, and then stored away as if they were permanent facts rather than temporary guesses. Think about how many decisions in your life have been shaped by a sentence that starts with the words, "Everybody knows," or "That's just how it is," or "There's no point trying." These phrases carry enormous weight, yet almost nobody stops to check whether they are actually accurate. A person assumes a certain career path is impossible for someone like them without ever testing that assumption against real evidence. A person assumes their partner is upset about one thing when the truth is something entirely different, and an entire evening is spent responding to a story that was never true in the first place. A business owner assumes customers want a certain product, builds an entire strategy around that assumption, and only discovers the truth after months of wasted effort. Assumptions do not just sit quietly in the corner of your mind, they actively steer your choices, your relationships, and your future, all while disguising themselves as common sense. The discipline of questioning assumptions begins with a simple but uncomfortable admission. You do not actually know as much as you think you know. Most of what you call knowledge is really a collection of conclusions you reached quickly and never went back to verify. This is not a flaw unique to you. It is how every human mind operates, because verifying everything from scratch would be exhausting and slow. Your brain prefers speed over accuracy. It would rather give you a quick answer that feels confident than a slow answer that admits uncertainty. This served your ancestors well when a fast guess about danger could save a life. It does not serve you nearly as well when a fast guess about your own potential quietly closes doors that were never actually locked. Learning to catch an assumption in real time takes practice, because assumptions rarely say, "I am an assumption." They speak in the voice of obvious truth. The way to catch them is to pay attention to certainty itself. Whenever you notice yourself feeling completely certain about something, especially something involving people, opportunities, or your own limits, treat that certainty as a signal to slow down rather than speed up. Ask yourself a simple question: how do I actually know this? Not how does it feel, not what have I always believed, but what real evidence supports this conclusion. Very often, when you trace a strong belief back to its source, you find surprisingly little evidence holding it up. You find a single bad experience turned into a permanent rule. You find a comment someone made once, years ago, that somehow became a life sentence. You find a fear dressed up as a fact. Consider how this plays out in ordinary conversations. Someone sends a short reply to your message, and immediately your mind assumes they are angry with you or losing interest. That assumption did not arrive with proof attached. It arrived because your mind filled in a gap with the explanation that felt most familiar, often the explanation that matches an old fear, rather than the explanation that matches reality. The moment you catch yourself filling in a gap this way, you have caught an assumption in the act. The healthy response is not to swing wildly to the opposite assumption, deciding everything is fine with equal certainty. The healthy response is to hold the uncertainty honestly and ask rather than assume. A short reply might mean they are busy. It might mean nothing at all. Assuming the worst without checking is choosing a story and then living as if it were confirmed fact. This same pattern shows up in how people evaluate their own abilities. Someone tries a new skill once, struggles with it, and immediately concludes, "I am not good at this," as if one attempt were enough evidence to settle the question permanently. That single data point gets treated as a verdict rather than what it actually is, which is one early attempt at something that almost always improves with repetition. Questioning this assumption means asking whether one attempt is really enough evidence to build a permanent identity around, or whether the honest answer is simply, "I have not practiced this enough yet to know what I am capable of." Real-world application of this skill requires building a habit of pausing before accepting a thought as settled. When a strong belief arises, especially one that limits you or paints someone else in a harsh light, treat it the way a careful investigator treats a lead rather than a verdict. Ask what evidence actually supports it. Ask what evidence might contradict it. Ask whether you are interpreting a situation based on what is actually happening or based on a story your mind built quickly to fill in the blanks. This single habit, practiced consistently, changes the entire texture of how you experience your days. Conflicts that once triggered immediate anger start to include a pause where you consider other explanations. Opportunities that once triggered immediate dismissal start to receive a second look, because you catch yourself questioning whether your instant no was based on real limitation or old assumption. There is also a deeper layer to this practice, and it involves questioning the assumptions you hold about entire categories of people and situations. Many of the beliefs that shape how you treat others were never chosen deliberately. They were absorbed from your surroundings the same way individual personal beliefs were absorbed, through repetition and example, rather than careful evaluation. A person raised in an environment that spoke a certain way about a particular group of people, a certain kind of career, or a certain type of relationship, often carries those assumptions forward without ever holding them up to the light. Critical thinking demands that you eventually do hold them up to the light, not because doing so is comfortable, but because an unexamined assumption about people or the world will quietly distort every decision that touches it. You cannot make wise choices about who to trust, who to hire, who to love, or what path to pursue if the lens through which you view those choices is warped by assumptions you never chose to question. None of this means living in constant doubt, paralyzed by uncertainty about every thought that crosses your mind. That would be its own kind of trap, trading blind certainty for endless hesitation. The goal is not to distrust everything. The goal is to develop a habit of checking your most powerful, most automatic conclusions, particularly the ones that carry heavy consequences. Not every thought needs an investigation, but the thoughts that shape major decisions, that color your view of another person, that convince you a door is closed before you have even tried the handle, those deserve a moment of honest scrutiny before you let them steer your life. Practice this daily in small, deliberate ways. When you catch yourself thinking, "I already know how this will go," stop and ask if that is genuine knowledge or a guess wearing the mask of knowledge. When you catch yourself explaining someone else's behavior with total confidence, remember that you are watching actions from the outside without access to their actual reasons, and leave room for an explanation you have not considered. When you catch yourself ruling out a goal because it seems obviously impossible, ask whether obviously impossible means you have real evidence it cannot work, or whether it simply means you have not yet tried. The mind that questions its own assumptions becomes far harder to manipulate, far harder to discourage, and far more accurate in how it reads the world. It stops mistaking familiarity for truth. It stops treating old conclusions as permanent verdicts. It starts approaching each new situation with fresh eyes rather than recycled fear. This is not weakness or confusion. This is strength of a rare and valuable kind. The strength to admit you might be wrong before the world forces that admission on you the hard way. Build this habit steadily, one assumption at a time, and you will find that many of the walls you believed were solid were never anything more than thoughts you forgot to question. Chapter 3. Separate facts from feelings to see situations clearly. There is a moment that happens to everyone, usually several times a day, where something occurs and your mind instantly produces a feeling about it, and that feeling arrives so fast and so strong that it gets mistaken for information about what actually happened. A coworker does not greet you the same way they usually do, and within seconds you feel a knot of worry, and that worry quietly becomes the lens through which you interpret everything else that happens with that person for the rest of the day. Nothing factual has actually been established, no conversation has taken place, no evidence has been gathered. Yet the feeling arrived with such force that it started acting like a verdict rather than a reaction. Learning to separate what actually happened from what you felt about what happened is one of the most valuable skills a clear-thinking person can build, because feelings and facts speak in almost the same voice, and most people never learn to tell them apart. A fact is something that can be observed and confirmed by anyone standing in the same place, looking at the same situation, with no personal history attached to it. A feeling is your internal reaction to that fact, shaped by your past, your fears, your mood that day, and your own private interpretation of what things mean. Both are real, both matter, but they are not the same thing, and treating them as interchangeable is where so much unnecessary suffering and so many poor decisions come from. If a friend cancels plans, the fact is simply that the plans were cancelled. Everything else, the sense that you were not a priority, the fear that they are pulling away, the sting of feeling forgotten, all of that is feeling, built on top of the fact, not contained within it. The fact alone tells you almost nothing about what it means. The meaning gets added by you, often within a fraction of a second, and usually without your permission. This matters because feelings, while completely valid as experiences, make terrible judges of truth. A feeling can be intense and still be wrong about what is actually happening. Fear can scream that a situation is dangerous when it is simply unfamiliar. Hurt can insist that someone meant to wound you when they were only tired or distracted. Shame can convince you that a mistake means you are fundamentally flawed, when it actually just means you are human and learning. The strength of a feeling has nothing to do with its accuracy. A feeling can be 100% real as an experience and still be built on a story that is not true. This is the trap that catches so many people, the assumption that if something feels overwhelmingly true, it must be true. Intensity is not evidence, it is only intensity. Separating fact from feeling starts with a simple practice you can use in any charged moment. When something happens that stirs a strong reaction in you, pause and write down, either on paper or simply in your own mind, exactly what occurred, using only language a camera could have captured. Not what it meant, not what it implied, not what it probably says about the other person's character, just the plain, observable event. Then, in a separate column, write down what you felt in response to that event. Doing this slows down a process that normally happens instantly and invisibly, and it forces you to see, in stark terms, how much of your reaction was built from raw information and how much was built from interpretation. Take a common example. Your manager sends a short email asking to speak with you tomorrow, with no other detail included. The fact is contained in the words themselves, nothing more. The feeling that often follows is something closer to dread, a sinking sense that something has gone wrong, that trouble is coming. Notice how much distance exists between those two things. The fact is neutral. The feeling has already written an entire story, complete with consequences, before a single additional piece of information has arrived. If you walk into that meeting already believing the story you're feeling constructed, you will likely appear defensive, anxious, or distracted, even if the actual purpose of the meeting turns out to be something positive or entirely unrelated to any wrongdoing. Your feeling did not just interpret the situation. It shaped how you showed up inside it, sometimes creating the very outcome it feared. This does not mean feelings should be dismissed or pushed away. That approach creates its own kind of damage. A person who becomes numb and disconnected from their own inner life in the name of appearing logical. Feelings carry real value. They often point towards something worth examining, a boundary that has been crossed, a need that has gone unmet, a pattern worth paying attention to. The goal is not to silence feelings, but to stop mistaking them for objective reports on reality. A feeling is data about your internal state. It is not automatically data about external truth. Both deserve attention, but they answer different questions, and confusing the two is where clear thinking breaks down. Real-world application of this skill shows up most clearly during conflict. Picture a disagreement with someone you care about. voices rise, and within moments the conversation stops being about the actual disagreement and becomes about the feelings the disagreement stirred up. Hurt turning into accusation, defensiveness turning into blame. Almost every painful argument follows this pattern, where two people stop discussing what actually happened and start defending their feelings, as though those feelings were unquestionable facts about the other person's intentions. A person who has trained themselves to separate fact from feeling can step into this same disagreement and pause long enough to ask, what actually happened here, separate from how upset I feel about it right now. That single pause, small as it seems, is often the difference between a conversation that repairs a relationship and one that damages it further. This skill also transforms how you handle setbacks. A plan falls apart, a goal is not reached on schedule, an attempt fails to produce the result you hoped for. The fact is simply that the outcome did not match the goal. The feeling that often follows is something heavier, a sense of failure, a fear that you are not capable, a quiet voice suggesting you should give up. Left unexamined, that feeling gets treated as proof, as though the emotional weight of disappointment were itself evidence that the goal was never achievable or that you were never suited for it. Separated from the feeling, the fact remains simple and far less crushing. This particular attempt, under these particular conditions, did not produce the result you wanted. That fact invites a next step. The feeling, if mistaken for fact, invites surrender. Practicing this daily means building the habit of asking a simple question whenever emotion runs high. What do I actually know right now? And what am I only feeling right now? Say it plainly to yourself in the moment. The facts I have are this. The feeling I am having is this. This tiny act of separation creates space between the event and your response to it. And inside that space lives your ability to choose a wise response instead of a reactive one. Over time, this becomes less of a deliberate exercise and more of a natural instinct, a quiet internal check that runs automatically whenever life throws something unexpected your way. The people who move through difficult situations with steadiness are not people who feel less than everyone else. They feel just as deeply. The difference is that they have trained themselves not to let the feeling stand in for the fact. They allow themselves to feel the full weight of disappointment, fear, or hurt, while still holding on to a clear, separate understanding of what actually took place. This clarity does not numb the emotional experience of life. It protects you from building your decisions, your relationships, and your sense of self on stories your feelings told you in moments when they were never meant to be trusted as the whole truth. Learn to hold both, the fact and the feeling, side by side without confusing one for the other, and you gain a kind of steadiness that no sudden emotional storm can easily shake loose. Chapter 4. Challenge your own thinking to uncover blind spots. There is a strange kind of blindness that has nothing to do with your eyes and everything to do with your mind, and the most unsettling part of it is that you cannot see it happening while it happens. A blind spot, by its very nature, hides from the person who has it. You do not walk around aware of the things you are missing. You walk around feeling completely confident, completely reasonable, completely certain that you see the full picture, while an entire section of reality sits just outside your view, invisible not because it is hidden by the world, but because your own mind has quietly decided not to look there. Learning to challenge your own thinking is how you go looking for what you cannot naturally see, and it is one of the bravest habits a person can build, because it requires turning your attention toward the very mind you rely on to do that looking. Most people spend their lives defending their thoughts rather than examining them. The moment an idea forms, a plan takes shape, or an opinion settles into place, the natural instinct is to gather support for it, not to test it. This is not a personal failing unique to certain people. It is simply how minds tend to operate when left unchecked. Once you believe something, you start noticing evidence that confirms it, and quietly skipping past evidence that challenges it, not because you are dishonest, but because agreement feels comfortable and disagreement feels like a threat. A person convinced they are right about a decision will remember every reason that supports it and barely register the warning sign that pointed the other way. This is not weakness of character. It is the default setting of an unexamined mind, and challenging your own thinking is the deliberate act of overriding that default. The first step in uncovering a blind spot is accepting a simple, humbling truth. Certainty is not the same as accuracy. You can feel completely sure about something and still be wrong, and in fact, some of the most confidently held beliefs turn out to be the least examined ones, precisely because confidence discourages further questioning. If you have never felt the need to double-check a belief, that is not proof the belief is solid. It might simply mean you have never looked closely enough to find the crack in it. The strongest thinkers are not the ones who feel the most certain. They are the ones who remain willing to test their certainty, even when doing so feels unnecessary or even a little insulting to their own intelligence. One practical way to challenge your own thinking is to deliberately search for the strongest argument against your position before you defend it. Most people, when they encounter disagreement, immediately search for the weakest version of the opposing view so they can dismiss it quickly and return to feeling right. This might feel satisfying in the moment, but it teaches you nothing and protects a blind spot rather than removing it. A far more useful habit is to sit down, on purpose, and ask what a thoughtful, intelligent person who disagreed with you would actually say. Not a caricature of them, not an exaggerated version easy to knock down, but their real, best reasoning. If you cannot construct a strong version of the opposing argument, you do not fully understand your own position either, because understanding something well includes understanding why a reasonable person might see it differently. Consider how this applies to a decision as ordinary as choosing to stay in a job you have outgrown. Every reason to stay probably feels solid: stability, familiarity, the comfort of knowing what to expect each day. Challenging your own thinking means asking what someone who cares about you but sees your situation with fresh eyes might notice that you have stopped noticing. They might see the way your energy has dimmed, the way you no longer mention any excitement about your work, the way you talk about the future in vague terms instead of specific plans. Your own mind, protective of the comfort you have built, may have quietly filtered out these signals because acknowledging them would demand uncomfortable action. An outside perspective, even one you imagine rather than actually hear, can sometimes reach places your own reasoning has learned to avoid. This is why seeking real outside perspective matters so much, not as a formality, but as an actual tool for seeing what you cannot see alone. A trusted friend who tells you only what you want to hear is pleasant company but useless for this purpose. What you need are people willing to say the uncomfortable thing, people who respect you enough to risk your temporary annoyance in exchange for your long-term clarity. When someone offers you a perspective that stings a little, resist the urge to explain why they are wrong before you have genuinely considered whether they might be right. That sting is often the exact sensation of a blind spot being touched for the first time. Blind spots also hide inside patterns you have stopped questioning simply because they are familiar. If every job you leave ends the same way, if every friendship follows a similar arc toward disappointment, if every plan seems to run into the same kind of obstacle, it is worth asking honestly whether the common factor across all these situations might be something in how you think, decide, or behave, rather than simply bad luck repeating itself endlessly. This is uncomfortable to consider because it shifts responsibility toward you, but that discomfort is exactly where growth becomes possible. Blaming outside circumstances every time keeps the blind spot safely hidden. Asking what role you might be playing is how you finally get a clear look at it. A useful daily practice is to end each day by reviewing one decision you made and asking what you might have missed. Not what went wrong necessarily, but what you did not consider at the time. Did you make that choice with full information, or did you fill gaps with assumption? Did you consider the other person's perspective fully, or only enough to argue against it? Did you rush toward a conclusion because it was comfortable rather than because it was thoroughly reasoned? This kind of nightly review, done honestly and without harsh self-judgment, slowly trains your mind to notice its own shortcuts in real time rather than only in hindsight. It also helps to pay close attention to defensiveness itself as a signal. When a comment or question makes you feel an unusually strong urge to defend yourself immediately, that sharp reaction is often worth examining rather than acting on right away. Genuine indifference to an inaccurate criticism rarely produces much heat. Strong defensiveness frequently shows up precisely when something true has been said, something your mind would rather not confront. Instead of rushing to prove the comment wrong, try sitting with it for a moment and asking what part of it, if any, might be pointing towards something real. None of this means doubting yourself constantly or losing confidence in your own judgment. A person paralyzed by endless self-questioning is not thinking clearly either. The goal is a steady, ongoing willingness to test your own conclusions the way you would test anyone else's, applying the same scrutiny to your own reasoning that you would apply to a stranger's argument. This willingness does not weaken your thinking, it strengthens it, because a belief that has survived honest challenge is far more reliable than one that has simply never been questioned. Build this habit patiently, and you will start to notice what you could not see before, not because the world changed, but because you finally turned around and looked at the parts of your own thinking you had been standing too close to see clearly. Chapter 5. Build mental discipline through small daily thinking exercises. No one builds a strong body by lifting a heavy weight once and calling it finished. Strength comes from small, repeated effort, done consistently over a long stretch of time, until what once felt difficult becomes almost effortless. The mind works the exact same way, yet most people never train it with anything close to the same intention they bring to their bodies. They will show up at a gym 4 times a week without fail, tracking every rep, but they will let their thinking run on autopilot year after year, never once treating clarity of mind as a skill that needs practice. Mental discipline is not a personality trait some people are simply born with. It is a muscle, and like any muscle, it grows through small, deliberate exercise repeated on ordinary days, not through occasional bursts of intense effort, followed by long stretches of neglect. The mistake most people make when they decide to improve their thinking is aiming too big, too fast. They resolve to read constantly, meditate for an hour, journal every night, and overhaul their entire mental life within a week, and within 10 days the whole plan collapses under its own weight, because willpower alone cannot sustain a routine that demands too much too soon. Real mental discipline is built the opposite way, through exercises so small they feel almost too easy to matter, practiced with such consistency that they eventually become part of how you naturally operate. A single set of stairs climbed daily will, over months, build more real strength than a marathon attempted once and never repeated. The same principle applies to training your mind. One of the simplest and most powerful daily exercises is the practice of naming your reasoning before you act on it. Before making even a small decision, pause for a few seconds and silently state to yourself why you are choosing this option over another. This sounds almost too basic to matter, yet most decisions throughout an ordinary day happen with zero conscious reasoning attached to them at all. You reach for your phone, you agree to a request, you avoid a task, all without ever articulating a reason, which means the decision was driven entirely by habit or impulse, rather than thought. Practicing this small pause, even for decisions as minor as what to eat or how to respond to a message, trains your mind to expect reasoning as a normal part of choosing, rather than treating reasoning as something reserved only for major life decisions. Over time, this habit extends itself naturally into bigger choices, because the mind that has practiced explaining small decisions finds it far easier to explain large ones with the same clarity. Another simple daily exercise involves taking one belief you hold, something small and low stakes, and spending 5 minutes constructing the strongest possible case against it. Not a mocking or half-hearted attempt, but a genuine, serious argument, built as if you were trying to convince a smart, skeptical stranger. This does not mean abandoning the belief afterward. Most of the time, you will finish the exercise still holding the same view, but holding it with far more understanding of its foundation and its limits. The value is not in changing your mind every day. The value is in keeping the muscle of genuine reconsideration active, so that when a belief truly does deserve to be questioned, you already have the practiced ability to do it honestly rather than defensively. A third exercise, one of the most practical for daily life, is what might be called the pause before reaction. Choose one moment each day, whether it is a frustrating email, a slow driver, an unexpected delay, or a sharp comment from someone else, and instead of responding, the instant emotion rises, count silently to 10 before you say or do anything. 10 seconds feels almost nothing in the moment, and yet it is often the exact gap needed for a reflexive, regrettable reaction to soften into a considered, deliberate response. This is not about suppressing feeling. It is about creating enough space between stimulus and reaction that your thinking mind, rather than your fastest impulse, gets a chance to participate in what happens next. Practiced daily on small irritations, this pause becomes available automatically during the moments that truly matter, the arguments, the setbacks, the decisions made under pressure, when a rushed reaction could cost far more than a slow breath ever would. Reading also serves as mental exercise, but only when done with active engagement, rather than passive consumption. Scrolling through short bursts of information trains the mind toward distraction and shallow processing, jumping from one fragment to another without ever sitting long enough with a single idea to test it, question it, or connect it to something else you know. Choosing instead to read something substantial for even 15 minutes a day, and pausing occasionally to ask what you agree with, what you doubt, and what you would add, builds a very different kind of mental muscle than endless scrolling ever will. The goal is not simply to consume more information. The goal is to practice engaging with ideas actively, the same way lifting a weight engages a muscle far more than simply looking at one. Writing down your thinking, even briefly, strengthens this discipline further because writing forces vague impressions into specific words. A thought that feels clear inside your head often reveals gaps, contradictions, or unfinished reasoning the moment you try to put it into a complete sentence on paper. Spending even 5 minutes each evening writing down the clearest thought you had that day, along with the reasoning behind it, trains your mind to demand precision from itself rather than settling for a fuzzy sense of having thought something through. This does not require elaborate journaling or perfect grammar. It simply requires the honest attempt to state, in plain words, exactly what you think and why you think it. None of these exercises demand hours of your day. Together, they might take 15 or 20 minutes, spread across small pockets of time that already exist within an ordinary schedule. The power is not in the length of the exercise, but in its repetition. A person who pauses before 10 small decisions a day, who questions one small belief each morning, who counts to 10 before reacting once daily, who reads with attention for a quarter of an hour, and who writes a single honest paragraph each night, will, within a matter of months, think with a clarity and steadiness that stands miles apart from where they started. Not because any single exercise was dramatic, but because small, consistent effort compounds in the mind, exactly as it compounds in the body. Discipline of this kind does not announce itself with fireworks. It builds quietly, one unremarkable day at a time, and it often goes unnoticed by the person practicing it until a moment arrives that would once have overwhelmed them, and instead they find themselves responding with a calm, clear mind they did not have to force. That is the real measure of mental discipline, not how impressive the daily exercise looks from the outside, but how naturally clear thinking shows up when life finally demands it. Start small, stay consistent, and trust that a mind trained daily in these quiet ways will rise to meet the loud moments when they come. Chapter 6. Overcome emotional reactions by pausing before you respond. There is a gap that exists in every single person, a small space of time between the moment something happens and the moment you respond to it. For most people, that gap is so thin it might as well not exist at all. Something is said, and the reply flies out before a single thought has passed through the mind. Something goes wrong, and the reaction happens instantly, as automatic as a knee jerking when a doctor taps it with a small hammer. This is not weakness. This is simply how the nervous system was built, wired across countless generations to respond to threat with speed rather than reflection, because a slow response to real danger could once mean the difference between survival and disaster. The trouble is that almost nothing you face today is the kind of danger that wiring was designed for, yet the same instant, forceful reaction still fires off anyway, aimed now at emails, comments, delays, and disappointments instead of predators. Learning to widen that gap, even slightly, is one of the most transformative skills a person can develop, because inside that widened space lives the difference between a life run by impulse and a life run by choice. An emotional reaction and a thoughtful response are not the same thing, even though they often look identical from the outside in the first half second. A reaction comes from the oldest, fastest part of the mind, the part built purely for speed, unconcerned with nuance or consequence. A response comes from a slower, wiser part of the mind, the part capable of weighing outcomes, considering other people's perspectives, and choosing words or actions with actual intention behind them. The problem is that the fast part almost always moves first, arriving with such force and such apparent certainty that it convinces you it is the only voice worth listening to. Unless you deliberately create a pause, the fast reaction wins by default every single time, not because it is wiser, but simply because it is faster, and speed alone is mistaken for authority. Consider what happens in the body during a moment of strong emotional charge, whether it is anger, embarrassment, fear, or hurt. Heart rate rises, breathing quickens and grows shallow, muscles tense as though preparing for action, and blood shifts away from the parts of the brain responsible for careful reasoning toward the parts responsible for immediate physical response. In this state, you are, quite literally, operating with reduced access to your own intelligence. This is not a metaphor. It is a physical reality of how the body handles perceived threat. Trying to think clearly while your body is flooded this way is like trying to read fine print while running at full sprint. The words might technically be there in front of you, but you are in no condition to make sense of them. This is precisely why so many people say things in the heat of a moment that they deeply regret only minutes later, once the flood has passed and the reasoning mind has come back online. The person did not suddenly become foolish. They simply spoke from a state in which wisdom was temporarily unavailable to them. The pause is what allows the body to settle enough for the reasoning mind to return to the conversation. It does not need to be long. Even a handful of seconds is often enough to shift from pure reaction towards something closer to a real response, because the goal is not to eliminate emotion entirely, but to let the initial wave pass before deciding what to do with it. A useful practice is to notice the very first physical sign that a strong reaction is beginning: a tightening in the chest, heat rising in the face, a clenching in the jaw, and treat that sensation as a signal rather than a command. The sensation is simply information telling you that your body has entered a heightened state. It is not an instruction demanding immediate action. Recognizing the difference between a signal and a command is where the real power of the pause begins. Breath offers one of the simplest and most reliable tools for creating this pause, because breath is one of the few bodily processes that operates automatically, yet can also be controlled deliberately whenever you choose to take hold of it. A slow breath in, held for a moment, and released even more slowly than it was taken in, sends a direct signal to the nervous system that immediate danger is not present, which allows the body to begin settling even in the middle of a tense situation. This is not a trick or a gimmick. It is a direct, physical lever available to you in any moment, requiring no special equipment and no advanced preparation, only the willingness to use it the instant you notice the first sign of a rising reaction. Real-world application of this pause shows up most clearly in conversations that carry weight, whether with a partner, a colleague, a family member, or a stranger who has said something that stings. Picture receiving a message that feels dismissive or unfair. The instinct is to type a reply immediately, often a sharp one, and send it before the feeling has had any chance to settle. A trained pause interrupts this sequence. It might look like setting the phone down for several minutes before responding, or reading the message once, closing the conversation, and returning to it only after a short walk or a few slow breaths. During that gap, the sharp first draft of a reply often reveals itself to be less about the actual situation and more about the sting of the moment, and the response that eventually gets sent, once the pause has done its work, tends to be clearer, calmer, and far less likely to cause damage that takes far longer to repair than it took to create. This same principle applies powerfully to decisions made under pressure, not just conversations. A sudden setback at work, an unexpected expense, a plan falling apart at the last moment. All of these tend to produce an urge toward immediate, drastic action, as though something must be done this very instant to make the discomfort stop. Very often, the wisest choice in these moments is not a dramatic action, but simply the decision to wait a little longer before deciding anything at all. Urgency and importance are not the same thing, yet strong emotion tends to disguise one as the other, making every uncomfortable moment feel as though it demands instant resolution. Pausing does not mean ignoring the problem. It means giving yourself enough space to address the problem with a clear mind instead of a flooded one. Building this habit daily starts with small, low-stakes moments, rather than waiting for a major crisis to test it for the first time. Practice pausing for 3 slow breaths before responding to a mildly annoying message. Practice waiting a few extra seconds before replying when someone interrupts you or says something slightly frustrating. Practice noticing the first flicker of irritation during small daily frustrations, a delay, a minor inconvenience, a small disagreement, and treating that flicker as an invitation to slow down rather than speed up. These small repetitions matter because the pause, like any skill, grows stronger with practice. A person who has never practiced pausing during minor irritations will struggle enormously to find that same pause during a genuine crisis, when emotion runs far stronger and the stakes feel far higher. A person who has practiced the pause consistently on small matters finds, almost to their own surprise, that the same steadiness becomes available even in the moments that matter most. None of this requires becoming someone who no longer feels anger, hurt, or fear. Those feelings are part of being human, and trying to eliminate them entirely is neither possible nor wise. The goal is not the absence of emotion, but the presence of choice within it, the ability to feel something fully while still choosing, with a clear mind, what to do about it. This is the quiet strength found in every person who seems able to remain steady while others around them lose their footing entirely. They are not free of emotion. They have simply practiced, again and again, in small, ordinary moments, the discipline of pausing long enough to let their wisdom catch up with their feelings before either one gets to speak on their behalf. Chapter 7. Analyze problems from multiple angles before making decisions. Picture a single stone lying on the ground. Look at it from directly above, and it appears as a flat, simple shape. Kneel down and look at it from the side, and suddenly it has height, texture, layers you could not see a moment ago. Walk around it entirely, and you begin to notice cracks on one face, smoothness on another, a color that shifts depending on where the light hits it. The stone never changed. Only your position changed, and with it, what you were able to see. Most problems in life behave exactly the same way. They are not simple flat objects with one obvious shape. They are stones with many faces, and the person who only ever looks from one angle will always mistake a small part of the problem for the whole of it. Most people make decisions from a single viewpoint without ever realizing they have only looked at one side. They see the situation through their own immediate feelings, their own personal stakes, their own habitual way of interpreting events, and they mistake that single view for the complete picture. This is not because people are careless or foolish. It is because looking at a problem from only one angle is fast, and slowing down to walk around it and examine it from other sides feels, in the moment, like an unnecessary delay. But decisions made from a single angle are decisions made with incomplete information, and incomplete information, no matter how confidently it is acted upon, tends to produce results that surprise and disappoint the very person who acted on it. Consider a common workplace situation. A colleague sends a blunt, short message that seems to criticize your work. Viewed from the angle of your own feelings, this looks like disrespect, perhaps even an attack on your competence, and the natural response is defensiveness or resentment. But shift the angle. Consider the situation from the colleague's position, someone who might be juggling 5 urgent deadlines that day, communicating quickly, not out of disrespect, but out of sheer time pressure. Shift again, to the angle of the actual content of the message stripped of tone, and you might find the underlying point is valid, even useful, once separated from how it was delivered. Shift once more, to the angle of the working relationship over time, and you might realize this single blunt message says very little about the overall respect this person has shown you across many months. None of these angles alone tells the whole story. Together, they build something far closer to the truth than any single glance could offer. The first angle, worth deliberately examining in any significant decision, is the angle of the people affected who are not you. It is natural to view a decision primarily through the lens of how it impacts your own goals, your own comfort, your own immediate desires, but very few decisions exist in complete isolation from other people. A choice to leave a job affects not only your career, but potentially a family, depending on that income. A choice to end a friendship affects not only your own peace, but someone else's sense of connection and trust. Taking a genuine moment to ask how this decision looks from the position of everyone it touches, not to necessarily change your choice, but to fully understand its true weight, produces decisions made with far more wisdom than choices made while looking only inward. A second angle worth examining is time itself, viewing the decision not only through the eyes of who you are today, but through the eyes of who you will be a year from now, 5 years from now, and even further still. A decision that feels urgent and enormous in this current moment often shrinks considerably when viewed from further down the road, while a decision that seems small and easy to postpone today sometimes carries consequences that grow larger the longer they are ignored. Asking yourself, will this matter as much a year from now, and will I regret not acting differently 5 years from now, forces the mind to step outside the narrow window of the present moment and consider the fuller arc of a life still unfolding. A third angle involves deliberately searching for the opposite conclusion before settling on your own. If your instinct leans strongly toward one choice, spend real time constructing the strongest possible case for the other option, not as a formality, but as a genuine attempt at persuasion aimed at yourself. This is uncomfortable because it means arguing against something you already want to believe, but this discomfort is exactly what makes the exercise valuable. A decision that survives a serious attempt to argue against it stands on far sturdier ground than a decision that was never truly tested in the first place. A fourth angle worth considering is the practical angle of resources and constraints, stepping back from the emotional and philosophical dimensions of a decision to ask plainly what is actually possible given the time, money, energy, and circumstances actually available. Grand plans built without honest attention to real constraints often collapse, not because the idea was flawed, but because the practical angle was never seriously examined. A decision considered from every emotional and relational angle, but never checked against reality, remains incomplete, no matter how thoroughly the other angles were explored. Real-world application of this practice looks like building a simple habit before any decision that carries real weight. Before finalizing a choice, ask at least 3 separate questions from 3 separate positions. How does this look from the perspective of someone directly affected by it who is not me? How will this look when I glance back at it from a year or 2 into the future? What is the strongest argument against the choice I am currently leaning toward? Even spending 10 focused minutes moving through these 3 questions transforms a decision made from a single narrow glance into a decision considered from genuine breadth. And that breadth is very often what separates a choice later regretted from a choice later respected, even when the outcome does not unfold exactly as hoped. This practice does not promise perfect decisions or guaranteed outcomes. Life contains too much uncertainty for any method to promise that. What this practice does offer is the quiet confidence of knowing you looked at the stone from more than one side before deciding what it was. That confidence changes how a person carries a decision forward, even through difficulty, because a choice made after honest, multi-angled examination rarely produces the same bitter regret as a choice made in haste from a single, narrow view. Walk around your problems before you decide what they are. Look at them from where the other person stands, from where your future self will stand, from the strongest opposing argument you can construct, and from the plain, practical ground beneath your feet. The picture that forms from these combined angles will almost always be wiser, steadier, and far closer to the truth than anything a single glance could ever offer you. Chapter 8. Strengthen your judgment by learning from past mistakes. Every mistake you have ever made is still teaching somewhere, whether you are attending the lesson or not. This is the part most people never fully grasp. A mistake does not stop offering its wisdom once the pain of it fades. It sits there, patiently, holding valuable information about how you think, how you decide, and where your judgment tends to slip, and it will keep offering that information for as long as you are willing to go back and actually look at it. The tragedy is not making mistakes, because mistakes are simply the unavoidable cost of attempting anything real. The tragedy is making the same mistake twice, 3 times, 10 times, because the lesson sitting right there inside the first one was never actually collected. There is a particular kind of pain that comes with remembering a past failure, and most people handle that pain in one of 2 unhelpful ways. Some push it away entirely, refusing to think about it, changing the subject the moment it surfaces in memory, treating the mistake like a wound better left untouched. Others do the opposite, replaying it endlessly, punishing themselves over and over with the same scene, extracting nothing but shame from an experience that could have offered something far more useful. Neither approach produces growth. Avoidance guarantees you learn nothing because you never look closely enough to see what happened. Endless replay guarantees you learn nothing either, because shame narrows the mind rather than opening it, and a mind clenched in self-punishment is in no condition to extract a clear lesson from anything. There is a third way, quieter and less dramatic than either extreme, and it is the only one that actually strengthens judgment over time. This third way begins with treating a mistake the way a careful investigator treats a case, rather than the way a judge treats a defendant. An investigator does not exist to punish. An investigator exists to understand exactly what happened, in what order, and why, so that the same failure does not repeat itself unnoticed. This shift in posture changes everything about how a mistake gets processed. Instead of asking, "Why am I like this?" a question that leads nowhere but deeper into shame, the investigator asks, what specific decision, at what specific moment, led to this outcome, and what information was available at that moment that I did not use well. This is a completely different question, and it produces a completely different result. Consider a financial mistake, perhaps money lost on a decision made too quickly, without proper research, driven mostly by excitement or fear of missing out. The self-punishing response spends its energy on global statements. "I am terrible with money. I always mess things up. I will never get this right." These statements feel emotionally honest in the moment, but are almost useless practically, because they are too broad to act on. You cannot fix, "I am terrible with money." It is not a specific enough problem to solve. The investigator's response looks instead at the actual sequence of decisions. What led me to skip the research I normally would have done? What feeling was present right before I made the final decision? Was I acting from a place of clear thinking or from urgency created by someone else's pressure or my own impatience? These questions produce answers you can actually use the next time a similar situation arises, because they point to a specific pattern rather than a vague character flaw. Every mistake, examined honestly, tends to reveal one of a small handful of root causes. Sometimes the mistake came from acting on incomplete information when more information was actually available and simply not sought out. Sometimes it came from ignoring a quiet doubt that was present the entire time but got overridden by excitement, pressure, or fear. Sometimes it came from a blind spot, a hidden belief or hidden assumption operating exactly as described in earlier chapters, steering the decision without ever being consciously examined. Sometimes it simply came from acting too quickly, skipping the pause that might have allowed a clearer, more considered response. Identifying which of these categories a particular mistake falls into turns a painful memory into a specific, useful diagnosis, rather than a vague cloud of regret hanging over your sense of yourself. Real-world application of this practice means building a habit of reviewing significant mistakes with structured honesty rather than either avoidance or endless replay. When something goes wrong in a way that carries a real lesson, take time, once the initial sting has settled a little, to write down 3 things plainly. What actually happened, described factually rather than emotionally. What decision or moment most directly led to that outcome. What you will do differently the next time a similar situation presents itself. This last question matters enormously, because a mistake without a specific, actionable adjustment attached to it tends to simply repeat itself in a new disguise. The goal is not to relive the pain of the mistake. The goal is to extract the 1 or 2 specific, practical insights buried inside it, and then set the rest of the emotional weight down, because carrying that weight indefinitely serves no purpose once the lesson has been collected. This process also requires a particular kind of honesty about the role you actually played, neither exaggerating your fault into something crushing, nor minimizing it into something dismissible. Both distortions block real learning. A person who blames themselves entirely for a situation that involved factors beyond their control ends up building false lessons, learning to fear things that were never actually within their power to prevent. A person who blames everything and everyone except themselves ends up learning nothing at all, since no lesson is possible when no responsibility is accepted anywhere. The accurate middle ground, acknowledging exactly what was and was not within your control, is harder to find than either extreme, but far more valuable once located. There is also real strength in returning to old mistakes periodically, not to relive the pain, but to notice how your understanding of them has changed with time and distance. A decision that once felt like an unforgivable failure often looks, years later, like a reasonable choice made with the limited information and limited experience you had at that point in your life. This does not mean excusing genuine carelessness or repeated patterns of poor judgment, but it does mean extending yourself the same fair, balanced evaluation you would extend to someone else facing the same circumstances. Judgment strengthened through self-punishment tends to produce a fearful, hesitant version of you, afraid to act at all, rather than willing to act wisely. Judgment strengthened through honest, structured reflection produces something far more useful, a version of you that acts with increasing skill precisely because past missteps were studied rather than buried or endlessly relived. Over time, a person who consistently mines their mistakes for real lessons develops something that looks, from the outside, almost like intuition, a fast, accurate sense for which decisions carry hidden risk and which paths tend to lead somewhere worthwhile. This is not magic, and it is not talent handed down at birth. It is simply the accumulated result of many small, honest reviews, each one adding a little more precision to your internal sense of judgment. Every mistake carries a lesson inside it, waiting patiently to be collected. The only question is whether you are willing to sit with the discomfort of a wrong turn long enough to actually pick that lesson up, or whether you will let it lie there unclaimed, waiting to teach the exact same lesson again the next time you happen to walk past it. Chapter 9. Apply logical reasoning to solve real-life challenges. A carpenter does not walk up to a piece of wood and start cutting based on a feeling about where the cut should go. A carpenter measures. A carpenter checks the measurement twice, marks a clear line, and follows that line with steady, deliberate hands. This is not because a carpenter lacks intuition or creativity. It is because certain kinds of problems, the kind where a wrong move cannot easily be undone, demand a structured process rather than a hopeful guess. Life presents you with exactly this same kind of problem constantly, and yet most people approach their biggest decisions with far less structure than a carpenter brings to a simple piece of furniture. Logical reasoning is the measuring tape and the marked line for the mind. It will not remove all uncertainty from a decision, but it will keep you from cutting blindly through something that matters. Logical reasoning, stripped of any complicated language, simply means moving from what you actually know toward a conclusion in a way that can be traced, step by step, and checked for errors along the way. It is the opposite of jumping straight from a feeling to a conclusion without ever examining the path in between. Most people, most of the time, skip the path entirely. They arrive at a decision the way a person might arrive at a destination by teleporting, with no memory of the route taken and therefore no ability to check whether the route made sense. Logical reasoning insists on walking the actual road, one visible step after another, so that if something goes wrong, you can look back and see exactly where the path went astray. The starting point of any logically reasoned decision is a plain, honest statement of the actual problem, separated from every assumption, feeling, and old belief that tends to attach itself automatically. This sounds simple, yet most people skip straight past it, moving instead into solutions before the problem has even been clearly defined. Someone struggling in their career might say the problem is that their boss does not like them, when a clearer, more accurate statement of the problem might be that their current role no longer uses their strongest skills, or that they have not communicated their contributions clearly to the people who make decisions about advancement. These are very different problems, and they call for very different solutions. Time spent clarifying the actual problem before rushing toward an answer is rarely wasted time, even though it can feel that way when a person is eager to act quickly. Once the problem is clearly stated, logical reasoning asks you to gather the relevant facts, and only the relevant facts, setting aside opinions, rumors, and assumptions that have not been verified. This step requires a kind of discipline many people resist, because facts are sometimes less satisfying than a strong feeling about a situation. A feeling arrives complete and confident. A fact often arrives incomplete, requiring you to admit you do not yet know everything you would like to know. Gathering facts might mean actually asking someone a direct question instead of assuming their motives. It might mean looking at real numbers instead of a vague sense that things are going badly or well. It might mean researching an unfamiliar situation instead of relying on a second-hand story about how these things usually go. The strength of any conclusion depends entirely on the quality of what it was built from, and a conclusion built on assumption rather than fact will always be less reliable than one built on verified information, no matter how confidently it is held. With a clear problem and solid facts in hand, logical reasoning then asks you to consider the possible options and trace each one forward to its likely consequences, rather than stopping at the first option that comes to mind and accepting it simply because it arrived first. This is where many decisions go wrong, not because the reasoning was faulty, but because the reasoning never actually happened, replaced instead by the first available idea, dressed up afterward, with justifications built to support a choice that was never truly examined. A useful practice here is forcing yourself to name at least 2 additional options beyond the first one that occurs to you, even if those additional options seem less appealing at first glance. The simple act of generating alternatives interrupts the mind's tendency to seize the first idea and defend it, opening space for genuine comparison rather than false confirmation. Tracing consequences forward means asking, plainly, what is likely to happen if I choose this path, and then asking the same question of the next step and the step after that, rather than stopping the analysis at the very first result. A decision to take on significant debt for an opportunity might look appealing when you only trace the immediate consequence, more money available right now. Tracing the reasoning further forward reveals the monthly payments, the interest accumulating, the pressure that debt places on future choices, and only with that fuller chain of consequences visible can a person weigh the decision with real accuracy. Shortcut thinking stops at the first pleasant consequence and calls the analysis finished. Logical reasoning insists on following the chain further before settling on a conclusion. Real-world application of this process shows up clearly in a decision like considering a career change. A person using pure feeling might decide based entirely on which option sounds more exciting in the moment, without examining anything further. A person applying logical reasoning would first state the actual problem clearly, perhaps dissatisfaction with growth opportunities rather than dissatisfaction with the work itself. They would gather real facts, actual salary ranges, actual demand in the new field, actual skills required, and how those compare to skills already possessed. They would generate more than one option, perhaps including a lateral move within the current company as well as a complete change of industry. They would trace each option forward, considering not just the first 6 months, but the following several years, asking how each path is likely to unfold, rather than only how it feels to imagine right now. This process takes real time and effort, considerably more than simply following a gut feeling, but it produces a decision built on something far sturdier than excitement alone, and sturdier decisions tend to hold up far better when circumstances inevitably shift. None of this requires becoming a cold, calculating person who ignores emotion entirely. Feeling and intuition still matter and often carry real, valuable information, particularly once they have been developed through the kind of honest experience and reflection described in earlier practices. Logical reasoning does not silence intuition. It gives intuition a partner, someone to check its work, someone to ask whether the strong pull toward a particular choice is backed by solid ground or built on nothing more than a passing mood or an old fear reacting on autopilot. The strongest decisions usually come from this partnership, intuition offering direction and logical reasoning testing that direction against facts, alternatives, and consequences before it gets acted upon. Practicing this daily does not require treating every small choice like a courtroom case. Save the full process for decisions that genuinely carry weight, the ones that would be costly to get wrong and difficult to undo. For those decisions, slow down deliberately. State the problem plainly before reaching for a solution. Gather real facts rather than settling for assumption. Generate more than one option before choosing. Trace each option forward further than the first pleasant or unpleasant result. This structured approach will not guarantee a perfect outcome every time, because no process can account for every variable life might introduce. What it will guarantee is a decision you can stand behind with clear eyes, one you made with your full reasoning engaged, rather than one that simply happened to you while your attention was elsewhere. That difference between deciding and merely reacting is the entire foundation on which a life built with intention finally begins to take shape. Chapter 10. Commit to lifelong learning and sharpen your mind daily. A river that stops moving is no longer a river. It becomes a pond, still and quiet, and given enough time, a pond without fresh water flowing through it grows stagnant, closed off from the life that once moved through it freely. A mind works the same way. The moment you decide you have learned enough, that you understand yourself and the world well enough to stop reaching for more, something quietly begins to close inside you. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, the same way water grows still when nothing new keeps moving through it. Everything explored across the earlier parts of this journey, recognizing hidden beliefs, questioning assumptions, separating fact from feeling, challenging your own thinking, pausing before reacting, examining problems from multiple angles, learning from mistakes, reasoning through decisions with care. All of it depends on one final commitment to keep it alive. That commitment is the decision to remain a student of your own mind and your own life for as long as you are breathing. Lifelong learning is often misunderstood as something that belongs only to classrooms, degrees, and formal study, but the deepest kind of learning available to a person has very little to do with any of that. The most important learning happens in the quiet, ordinary moments of daily life, when you notice something about yourself you had not noticed before, when a conversation shifts your understanding of another person, when a mistake reveals a pattern you had never named. This kind of learning does not require a classroom. It requires only attention, humility, and the willingness to stay curious about a life that will always contain more than you currently understand. Humility sits at the very center of lifelong learning, and it is worth being honest about how uncomfortable real humility can feel. It is not weakness, and it is not self-doubt. It is simply the accurate recognition that no matter how much you have grown, how many mistakes you have examined, how many hidden beliefs you have uncovered, there will always be more waiting beneath the surface, more blind spots not yet found, more assumptions not yet questioned. A person who believes they have finished growing has usually just stopped looking, not because there was nothing left to find, but because looking had become uncomfortable and stopping felt easier. Real strength lies in continuing to look anyway, even after the initial excitement of a new insight has faded into the ordinary rhythm of daily life. Sharpening the mind daily does not require grand gestures or dramatic overhauls of your schedule. It requires small, steady practices, returned to again and again, the same way a blade stays sharp not through one intense sharpening, but through regular, consistent care over time. A blade left untouched, even one sharpened brilliantly on a single occasion, dulls again through ordinary use if it is never maintained. The mind follows the same pattern. Insight gained once and never revisited fades back into old habits far more easily than most people expect. The practices explored throughout this journey, noticing hidden beliefs, questioning quick assumptions, pausing before reacting, examining decisions from more than one angle, are not meant to be used once and set aside. They are meant to become part of how you move through an ordinary Tuesday, an ordinary conversation, an ordinary decision about what to eat or how to spend an evening. One of the most powerful daily habits for sustaining lifelong learning is simply asking, at the close of each day, what did I learn today that I did not know this morning? This question does not require a dramatic answer. Some days the answer will be small, a fact learned in passing, a realization about your own reaction to something minor. Other days the answer will carry real weight, a shift in how you see a relationship, a mistake examined honestly enough to yield a genuine insight. The value of the question is not in the size of the answer, but in the consistency of asking it, because a mind trained to expect a daily lesson begins, almost automatically, to notice lessons throughout the day that it would have otherwise let pass by unexamined. Seeking out people who see the world differently than you do is another essential practice for keeping the mind sharp, because growth slows considerably when every voice around you simply echoes back what you already believe. A conversation with someone who has lived a very different life, faced very different challenges, or reached very different conclusions offers a kind of learning no book can fully replace. The direct experience of having your own assumptions gently, or sometimes not so gently, challenged by another human perspective. This requires setting aside the urge to immediately defend your own view and instead genuinely listening long enough to understand how a thoughtful person arrived somewhere different than you did. You do not have to agree with everything you hear. You only have to remain willing to actually hear it. Reading widely, rather than narrowly, serves this same purpose. It is easy to read only what already confirms what you believe, building a comfortable echo chamber that feels like learning but functions mostly as reinforcement. Real growth often comes from deliberately picking up something outside your usual interests, a subject you know little about, a perspective you have not encountered before, a story from a life very different from your own. Each of these expands the raw material your mind has available when it reasons through new problems, and a mind with more raw material to draw from tends to find more creative, more accurate solutions than a mind working from a narrow, familiar set of ideas encountered 100 times before. Failure, revisited with the honest eyes described in earlier practice, remains one of the richest sources of lifelong learning available to any person, and committing to lifelong learning means committing to keep returning to failure as a teacher rather than something to be permanently avoided. A person who fears failure so completely that they stop attempting anything uncertain also stops learning almost entirely, because growth rarely happens inside the boundaries of what is already comfortable and familiar. Choosing, again and again, to attempt things that carry real risk of failure, and choosing afterward to examine what happened honestly, rather than either denying it or drowning in it, keeps the entire system of growth described throughout this book alive and active, rather than theoretical. Real-world application of lifelong learning means building small rituals that keep curiosity active rather than letting it fade into the background of a busy life. This might mean setting aside time each week to explore a subject entirely unrelated to your work or daily responsibilities, purely because it interests you. It might mean asking one genuine, curious question in every significant conversation rather than simply waiting for your turn to speak. It might mean revisiting old journal entries or old notes periodically, not to judge how far you have come, but to notice how your thinking has shifted, which itself becomes evidence that growth is actually happening, rather than simply being discussed. There is no finish line to this work, and that is not a discouraging thought once you sit with it honestly. A finish line would mean the story of your growth had ended, that there was nothing left to discover about yourself, about other people, about the world you move through every day. The absence of a finish line means the opposite. It means there is always more available to you, always another layer waiting beneath the one you have just uncovered, always another conversation, another mistake, another quiet moment of reflection, capable of teaching you something you did not know before it happened. This is not a burden, it is an invitation, extended to you every single day you are alive, to keep becoming someone slightly wiser, slightly clearer, and slightly more awake than you were the day before. Carry forward everything explored across this journey, not as a set of rules to follow perfectly, but as a way of moving through life with your eyes open rather than closed, your mind engaged rather than running on autopilot, your judgment strengthened by honest reflection rather than left untested. The river that keeps moving stays clear, stays alive, stays capable of carving new paths even through solid ground, given enough time and enough patient, consistent motion. Let your mind keep moving in exactly that same way, one small daily practice at a time, for as long as you are given the gift of another day to think, to learn, and to grow.